Okay, good evening. My name is Michael Rowe. Today I'm doing a historic interview with Mr. Charles Bowen. This interview is real special in that he's one of the few insiders that are still around who is uniquely qualified to talk about the era of policy, not from just an outsider, but someone who's actually knew the inner workings from various perspectives. Without further ado, this is Mr. Charles Bowen. So, Mr. Bowen, could you kind of give some of your background to let the people know why you're so uniquely qualified to discuss this topic?
In 1960, I was awarded a job in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office as an investigator. In those days, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office did fundamentally the same job that the Chicago Police Department did in various situations, though the office I thought was set up just to investigate and carry on investigations that the state's attorney was involved in. We actually initiated investigations in gambling and vice and other activities that were going on in the city of Chicago, and it was a means to control gambling and so forth. My boss in the state's attorney's office was Roswell Spencer, and Roswell Spencer had been a FBI agent and a supervising agent. He was, and he came here and was made the chief investigator in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And he had a great interest in syndicate gambling, and so he had no real knowledge how African Americans or blacks went about. He had been told that there was a network and a system to black in the gambling. He did not know it for himself. So he made me in charge of that unit, and gave me basically a free rein to go. And of course, in doing that, the guys that I brought into the office, I had 10 Chicago police officers who worked for me, and they were the top guys in whatever districts they worked in. They were the top guys in those districts, and I brought them over to the state's attorney's office. Actually, they were sent into the state's attorney's office by various aldermen, various elected officials who knew them and knew of their character and so forth, and they sent them to the state's. It was a reward for them to come to the state's attorney's office. So that's how I got involved in policy. Became my business, okay. So to speak. When and as I started to gather information on them, on the policy wheels themselves, of course, I started to realize that it was a true business in the black community. It was not a gamble. It was a business. It was a business that employed probably altogether some 20,000 African Americans worked in policy at various levels. There were the people who wrote the books. That could be your barber, your beautician, or any place where people came in and out. It could have been your bartender. It could have been a store clerk, or it could have been somebody like my grandmother who wrote her own books because she played enough where she had her own books to write. She didn't have to. Nobody had to come to her. She did her own. But then there were the field men who collected who set up policy stations. A policy station would have been like a small basement apartment, and people would go in, and this place would have all of the policy books. They would write for all of the policy books. In other words, if there was, say, 35 books, these people had the authority to write for all 35 books, and they sorted out who got the slips and so forth and so on. And these were, and this was a policy. This was a policy station. In other words, it was dedicated to doing nothing but policy. Okay, on a typical day, you could sit and watch, and you'd see 200 to 300 people go in and out of a policy station during the course of a day. Okay, and maybe more. The policy station, whoever ran the policy station, they didn't work for any one book. Like I said, they worked for a lot of books, 30, 40 books in that. Policy generally was done in like a 1, 2, 3, like maybe a 5-book setting. In other words, that you'd give the gambler a chance to play in what was called a 1-leg book, or a 2-leg book, or a short book. Now, the meaning of that is a 1-leg book meant that the drawing, the paper drawing, had figures, numbers on it that were put on just right down the center of the book. That's a 1-leg book. Just down the center of the policy slip would be, let's say, I don't know, 12, 14 numbers. I can't remember now how many numbers, but they were uniform, whatever it was, whatever the size of the book. I mean, whatever the number was, it was the same. And that was a 1-leg book. Then you'd have, if you turn that slip over, there would be 2 rows on either side of the book, running up the sides of the book. Okay, that was called a 2-leg book. A 2-leg book generally provided where the person could play. You realize? Do you not realize how the game? You want me to talk about how it was played?
Yeah, you can shed a little bit light on that.
Well, let's say in a 1-leg book, you played 3 numbers. You played 3 numbers. 3 numbers was called a gig. If you hit that meant that was your gig that you played, that you were successful. If you got all 3 numbers. If you wanted to box it, which would mean that if you played a nickel on the gig and a nickel on the box, you would get 50 cents. If you got 2 of the numbers that you played, if only 2 fell, then you would get 50 cents back, because that's what the box meant. Okay. Now, in the 2-leg book, you could play a gig for a nickel, but then you could also play a cross. The gig would have to come 3 numbers in a row on one side of the book, or the other, one or the other side of the book. Okay. But if you wanted to play if you wanted to cross that, which would mean that You got two numbers on one side when the numbers came out. You got two numbers on one side and one number on the other side. That would mean that you had a cross if you played a cross. But you'd have to place your bet on a nickel on the cross. Okay? Or you could play you could box it, which you would again get two numbers, but you'd only get 50. You would get 25 cents in that book because you had bigger chance to make it. You follow what I'm saying? So that's how. That was the basic. Now you could get like in the short book. Let's go back to the short book, which was like only 6 or 7 numbers. The short book, which was only 6 or 7 numbers, if you played a nickel in that book, you'd get $100. Your gamble, after all, was much better in that book. So you'd get $100 in that book. So then you could also box that one. In other words, getting two numbers, and I think you got $1 or $5 if you got two numbers in that book. I think it was $5 for a nickel.
Okay. Now, I often hear people use the term policy and numbers as interchangeable terms. Is that correct, or are they two different?
What now?
Some people they will say policy, or they will say numbers, and they will kind of use them interchangeably. But from my understanding, policy and numbers are somewhat different.
They were somewhat different, but it's according to who you're talking to, okay, and where they are. For an example, like if you were in New York and you said the numbers, it would mean policy. Okay. If you said that to me here in Chicago, it would generally mean that you were talking, you were not talking, when you said the numbers, you would not be talking about policy. You'd be talking about the clearinghouse. Okay. The clearinghouse was different in as much as it was a much better gamble. Okay. The clearinghouse was where you bet on the last 4 numbers of the stock exchange every day. Okay. That's you, but you wouldn't. Many people didn't even know what they were betting on. Okay. I mean, all they really knew was that you put down 4 numbers. You put down 4 numbers, and they give you a slip, a receipt for your money.
Would it kind of look like one of these?
No, this is a policy slip. Okay, here. All right. Now what you've got here, you got the Atlantic and Pacific, the Panama, the York. Here, you got. See, this is a crossover book, okay, and this is a book this is a 2-leg book. All of these are 2-leg books. Okay. These look like almost the same drawing, but they're not. Okay. But all of these are 2-leg books. If you had a 1-leg book, the numbers would run down the center. Okay. If you had a short book, you could have a one row of numbers down this side, and then a very short book over on this side. In other words, the numbers would stop here. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So yeah, so and that would be on the other side of this book. See, all the books had dual side, but 2 sides to them.
Would this be considered a numbers betting slip?
This is a numbers slip.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a number slip. Mm-hmm. Okay, so whoever this is playing. Yeah, they're playing they're playing the numbers, the 4 numbers here, and this is how much they're betting on them.
So this is an example of a number slip. And while I'm pulling out some photos, I want to show you a couple of additional photos. Do you recognize that?
That's a chopper.
A chopper, okay. Now what's the chopper?
A chopper is a printing press.
Okay, all right.
The roll comes down and comes through a cylinder, comes through this cylinder down here, and at the end there's a knife that chops off the paper.
Okay, so that's what they use to print the policy slips?
Yeah.
Okay, and what would this be?
That's a cake. Okay. That's where you draw that's where the numbers are drawn from. Right. And policy was so much better a gamble than anything else, because I could, like, if I wanted to, I could host in my living room a drawing. Okay. And I'd get some money from the wheel to host it. So I could have 20 or 25 of my friends who played in policy that day to come to my house and witness they would witness the drawing.
Okay, so it's less.
Yeah, so that's a cake.
Okay. And all right, and here's the photo of this gentleman here. Do you recognize him at all?
This guy here?
Yeah.
No, I don't recognize him.
Yeah, I think one of them is supposed to be a picture of Ted Rowe. He says it's kind of hard to see that.
I don't recognize him.
All right. But while I'm on the subject, like, who was Ted Rowe? Like, now what?
Well, now you know Ted is ahead of my time.
Oh, okay. All right.
Ted Rowe was ahead of my time. Everybody knew who he was, okay, but I did not know him personally. Okay. He was really in what I guess you'd call the golden era of policy, okay, where the guys, the policy kings. This guy certainly fits the profile, okay, of Rowe. I mean, he is sharp. He's a light-skinned African American, which most of them were. Okay. Most of the kings were light-skinned guys. Okay. Yeah, and they were most of them were. All of them, I can't think of one that wasn't educated. Okay. They were guys who went to college, who came out and said, I'm not going to go to the post office to go to work. That's just not what I'm going to do with my education. and they became and they went into the policy business.
Okay. Yeah. Now, this gentleman here, Lewis Caldwell, what connection did he have to policy? I know he's a politician, but what?
He was a politician. He was a state representative, and he worked his life trying to get policy legalized to the point, because all that's happened is they took policy, and that's what today's lottery is about. Every state now uses the lottery in some form or another, and when they instituted the lottery, they said it was going to be for education. I promise you, it's mostly gone to the general fund to use, because that was a cash cow for the states to use. So all they did was put the African Americans out of business and went into business themselves. That's exactly what they did.
Now, I understand that you had in your younger days, you dated a lady, and her dad was involved in policy, and it was one particular Christmas that you came back. Could you tell that story?
Oh, you're talking about you're talking. When you said dated a lady, I was wondering who you were talking about because
Her name was Barbara Hill.
yeah, Barbara Hill.
Okay.
Because hell, I was married since the time I was 18.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but this was before. Yeah, you're right. This is when I'm about 15, 16 years old. It was actually even earlier than that. This is actually when I was about. I graduated from grammar school at 13. So in my first year of high school, I had to be 14. And I met Barbara Hill. She was like the first person I met in high school.
Okay.
And Barbara Hill, her father, Mr. and Mrs. Hill, they lived at 43rd and State Street.
Okay.
And Mrs. Hill was an absolute gorgeous lady. I mean, gorgeous. Mr. Hill was kind of looked like Roe, or the guy that you think might be Roe.
Okay.
He was very light skinned, straight hair. He was heavy. He was a big guy, you know. And I only knew Barbara probably, I would say, 2 years before I went back to Corpus Christi. My mother took me out of DuSable, sent me back to Corpus Christi, and we lost track of each other. But the year that I was at DuSable, I used to walk Barbara Hill home in the evening, and this was near Christmas time. And I walked Barbara home, and she had a big house. They had a big apartment. They lived, I think, on the second floor in this building. And in those days, these were like flat apartments. They call them flats. Okay. And many people had cut them up, and they called them kitchenettes. Okay. I lived in a kitchenette. I lived at 4614 Calumet, and we had the same setup that Barbara's family had, except in my apartment, in the apartment that I lived in, there were like maybe five families living, and we all shared a bathroom. You know, my grandmother and grandfather that I lived with, we had what would have been the kitchen area and a back bedroom area. So we had like 2 rooms. But Barbara's family had this whole thing to themselves. So I was impressed by the mere fact that she had this elaborate apartment. So anyway, this was at Christmas time, and Barbara invited me to come by, and it wasn't what you'd call a party, you know. Mr. Hill was standing in the dining room, and I'll never forget the smells that was going through the apartment, because they were cooking pies, and they were cooking turkeys and hams, and I mean just a medley of things that you could smell, and as I stood there, you know, I'm saying, my God, this is like being in heaven, you know. And Mr. Hill, and so anyway, so he was like standing in the dining room, and there was a line of people who came in to greet him. None of them, my first observation was nobody took off their coats. Nobody was expected to stay any length of time. They all came, they greeted him, they came in, They greeted him. They got a drink. They toasted with him, and they all had on gloves that the fingertips were all out. Okay. Have you ever seen gloves that like that? Okay, so these men and women, none of them sat down. They'd all come in, they'd stand around for a few minutes, and then they would leave. Okay. And then another group would come in. Mr. Hill was standing and he had on his white shirt. He was at home, so he had on dress pants, but white shirt and suspenders holding his pants up, and he would put his hands in his suspenders, that kind of thing. None of them ate. None of them asked for anything. All they did was come in, greet him, and tell him how good it was to work for him. And they had a drink, and they left. And I said, that's the guy I want to be. If there's ever been a guy in my life that I wanted to be like, I wanted to be like Mr. Hill.
So I was kind of like the equivalent to seeing the Godfather or something like that. Okay.
He was the Godfather. I mean, in my day coming up, the truth is, I knew many Godfathers. They didn't kill anybody. They didn't, but they ran organizations without doing that. It was, if you're going to make some money, you're going to do what I tell you to do, and you're going to do it the way I tell you to do it. And that Dawson was as close to being a godfather as anything you'd ever. Better, really. I mean, like I say, he didn't have to kill anybody.
Now, it's a common belief that after Roe, he was the last black policy king to stay independent from the mob. That once he was murdered, the mob kind of took over all the policy. Is that true?
Not true.
Okay.
Not true.
All right. Now, who are some of the people who remain independent of the mob?
QB Coleman, who owned the landlady, and the junior. Okay. That was the name of his policy wheel. Stayed independent. Carl Lancaster stayed independent. Carl Lancaster stayed independent because of Charlie Craig.
Okay. Now, what wheel did he have, Lancaster?
Well, where was he? What now?
What policy wheel did he have?
Oh, the Atlantic and Pacific.
Oh, okay. It was one of those.
Yes. You got one.
You got one of the slips. Okay.
Yeah, the Atlantic and Pacific. Okay. Heavy, very heavy into real estate and other things.
And so how was he? Now you said he stayed independent because of Charlie
Younger.
Okay. Now who was he?
He was a police officer. Okay. He was a sergeant of police.
Okay.
And threatened the gangsters when they came to take over his wheel. He took two of them and put them in a under the street. What's it called? Yeah, in the
sewer thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And called their boss and told them that's where he could find them. If they came back again, they wouldn't be alive. Okay. Yeah, he was.
And what about Wakefield, the one who
Lawrence Wakefield?
Right. Was he able to stay independent?
Lawrence Wakefield had a little proposition called a Silver Streak. His was little. Now, you know the story about his wife.
Right, it had the millions of dollars in the house or something like that.
I think it was $3 million she had in the house. The police came and saw what you have in your
They saw one of the choppers.
Yeah. Okay. They saw one of those sitting in the apartment. To own one was illegal. I mean, it was an offense. Okay. These guys at that time, the police would come in the wagon would come if you had to go to the hospital. If you had to go to the hospital, like today, the fire department comes and takes you away to go to the, yeah. In those days, the police department would come in a wagon and take you to the hospital. That's what she had called him for. She had called him because he had become sick. He was actually dead. Okay. But he had become sick, and she called the police to come and take him to the hospital. And they saw that, so they called the vice officers of the district to tell them about the machine. They came and discovered the money. Okay. And it was so much money that I'm sure they said, we better call somebody else. And they called the FBI and they called everybody.
Now, switching gears a little bit, I want to show you another photo about this gentleman, the one sitting down. Do you recognize him at all?
He's young.
Now, I was told that was a picture of a gentleman by the name of Nolan Mack.
Could be Nolan.
Now, who was Nolan? Did he have any connection to the policy at all?
For a short period of time. Okay. Very short period of time. Nolan, this could be Nolan Mack. Okay. I mean, he was that young. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't remember him now like that. But Nolan was in the dope business. Okay. He was a barber by trade. He he worked in a Greek. He worked on 55th Street, but okay. The barber shop was owned by a Greek guy. The Greek's wife convinced Nolan. Nolan was doing the Greek's wife. Okay. Okay. And the Greek's wife convinced him that he could sell dope. Mm-hmm. Nolan went into that, got caught, and went to jail. In those days, that was a way out kind of an offense. No, blacks were not into that kind of trade. We didn't know anything about it at all. So when he came out, he wanted to go into the policy business because policy was still a money maker and he still had money. And I think he was convinced by more rational minds that he shouldn't be in the policy business, okay. That he should stay out of the policy business. So the syndicate, because he would bring, the feds didn't bother policy. They didn't do anything with policy. It was strictly a local situation with a good understanding with everybody that, you know, we understand it's an economic tool in the community.
Okay, so he would have brought too much heat to the business.
Yeah, bring too much heat to the business. So he did a lot of financing with his money. He did a lot of financing and he was one of the few real gangsters that we had. I mean, he was a gangster. And the syndicate called him and said to him, we'd like for you to be our enforcer. We don't need to come out there. We need, to have somebody out there who will bring the money in and so forth and so on. And Nolan told him, I'll take care of my business, you take care of yours. You don't mess with me and I won't mess with you. I mean, he was that kind of serious.
Okay. So the mob left him alone.
Yeah, I went to school with a guy named Lemon. I can't remember. Short guy, sharp dresser, and so forth. But if my memory serves me right, he was on his way to testify in a case. They found him in Evergreen Park with a 45 in his head. He was supposed to be, I think he was supposed to be testifying against Nolan. Oh, okay. Nolan went to the Panama Loan Company, which was located where the Grand Ballroom. Do you know where the Grand Ballroom is now?
The one on Cottage Grove?
On Cottage
Grove.
Yeah. 64th Street. Okay. Well, down on the first floor of that used to be the Panama Loan Company. And it looked like a little small bank. It was laid out that way. It was owned by a guy who owned the Panama Limited in policy his name was James Irving. And James Irving and his brother, and I'm trying to think of his brother's name. I can't remember his brother's name. But anyway, they borrowed $8,000 from Nolan, and they were supposed to return the $8,000 plus $4,000 on a Thursday after the Thursday drawings came out. Nolan went by, and the first time he went by, they told him that come back a day later and get his money. The next time Nolan came, he came with his shotgun like you going hunting over his shoulder and got his money. Okay. Nolan Mack they killed Nolan Mack on, I think if my memory serves me right, it was on the off-ramp of the Dan Ryan at Randolph Street.
The federal agents?
Federal agents.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Now we have about 10 minutes left, so I want to hit a couple of things. So in the last few minutes we have, could you explain what was a Wildcat policy wheel?
Yeah, Wildcat policy wheel was a policy wheel where we'd sit here and you'd say, you and I we would be talking, and you'd say, I'd like to make $20,000 over the next couple of months. So we'd say, well, okay, why don't we get us a policy wheel, and we'll come up with we'll find out. I'll say, well, I know a guy that does some printing, who owns
one of the
choppers.
Okay.
And all we have to do is get the cylinders made up in our, with our name on it, our policy name on it, and we get 2-3 guys that we know to go out and put these drawings out, and we'd be in business.
And when most of those guys who would do the Wildcat wheels, they were pretty much independent of the syndicate?
Yeah. Well, they'd only stay in business for 2-3 months. Okay. Like I said, and most of them wouldn't stay in business that long because they'd get knocked out.
Okay. Like by a bigger competition, or?
By the police, by the police, by threats of the guys who were really doing business would if they could evade them long enough, they would they could stay in business for a couple of months, 2-3 months.
And two other things. The first is, I feel that I want to talk
Gus Sanford. Gus Sanford was a guy that his business basically was printing up drawings of Wildcat wheels. Okay. there might be 10 of them going business a week. Yeah, I mean, really, they were all, I mean, all over the place. Yeah. But the standards were the people who had people who worked for them. Everybody knew who they were. They had been in business and stayed in business over the time. I mean, really.
Okay. All right. Now, there's a gentleman I want to speak about just briefly by the name of Sylvester Washington, aka Two Gun Pete.
Mr. Washington.
Mr. Washington, what type of guy was he? I mean, he's like a legend. Some say he was extremely brutal. I mean, there's all type of legends about Two Gun Pete.
Well, he was what he was. He was a enforcer. He didn't take no shit from anybody. I mean, when I was introduced to him, one of my guys had worked with him and had been a partner of his. So we were in the 2nd District, and I was waiting to meet him. And so this scruffy-looking little guy, I mean, he didn't look like the police at all. I mean, beard, and, when I saw him, I mean, I think I caught him near his end. I caught him near the end of the thing, because I don't think he was that way before. The pictures and so forth that I've seen of him, he was pretty sharp. But Larry Thompson said to me, says, "Charlie, I want you to meet the guns." And so I'm standing there, so he came up and he said, "Charlie, this is the guns." I said, "Mr. Washington," I said, forgive my man. I said, I love him. I said, but I don't want to be disrespectful to you. And he said, so he laughed, and so, but I always, gave him his props for who he was. In those days, policemen were legendary policemen. Like you had said, yeah. I mean, Charlie Younger, Sylvester Washington, Larry Thompson, Jim Kelly, Bob Harness. These guys were legendary police. I mean, they did a job. They didn't have to go looking for anybody. They'd call somebody. Somebody would commit a crime. They'd call somebody and say, "Who did it?" Set him up. I'll come get him. I mean, these guys, they did their police work every day. I mean, Lemon Works, Bryson and Sims. These were guys, man, nothing like them today.
So I guess that's cool. So we're at the end of our time. So could you just close with that story you once told about when you were younger and y'all guys on the corner and Two Gun Pete pulled up?
Yeah, when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, we were standing on the corner at 46th and Prairie, and there was a little store in the basement. We'd hang around. And the guns had a 1948 Mercury, four-door Mercury, a dark red car, and he had a little silver cylinder, as a triangular light or something that was on the top of the car. I don't know. I never did know what it was, because the car in those days, police cars, they didn't have them like they are today. A Toyota might drive up today and it's the police, But in those days, all the cars were basically standard cars. Even the plain clothes cars were still black cars, But the guns drove up, and he got out, and it was in the wintertime because I remember he had on a coat, but we were standing outside, and he said to the guys, he says, "Fellas, when I come back, I want you all to be gone off this corner." So he just turned his body as if he was about to walk back to the car. And then he turned his body back and said, "I'm back." And started swinging that club. Okay. Now, see, guy couldn't do that today. Everybody, the people would be all over him. But the truth is, how do you prevent crime? You stop crime where it is. You come up, if you come up on somebody who's suspicious like that, you need to question where you going, who are you, why are you standing here? That's what policemen did. So we either have to do one thing or the other. We either have to endure the crime, or we have to let the police do what they're supposed to do.
All right. Well, we're coming at the end of our time, so I really thank you for this informative interview. It's like valuable historical treasure. I really appreciate it. So Thank you, and that's a piece of policy history.